My name is Marian Locke, and I turned 60 last spring, an age that sounds steadier than it feels. You'd think by now I'd be used to silence, but this kind of silence is different. It's the heavy kind that fills a room after the movers leave, and the door finally clicks shut behind them. The apartment isn't much 4 rooms that echo when I walk barefoot across the wood floor. Boxes still line the walls, each marked in my handwriting. Books, linens. Kitchen, marriage. That last one makes me laugh every time I pass it. Inside are photos, a few anniversary cards and a collection of half-truths folded like keepsakes. I should throw them out, but I haven't yet. I was drinking lukewarm tea by the window when my phone lit up. The message came from my daughter Kendra, and for a moment I thought she might be checking in. Instead, the screen showed 9 words that hollowed me out. It wasn't the first cruel thing she'd said since the divorce. "You'll die poor and alone, Mom, just like you chose." I stared at it for a long time, long enough that the light shifted from gold to gray. Outside, Charleston's rooftops glowed under the last stretch of sun, but the words stayed on my screen sharp and cold. She's 35 now, bright, ambitious, and precise in her cruelty. When she was little, I used to braid her hair before school while she hummed scales under her breath. Now she measures success by square footage and stock options. Her father taught her that, not through words, but through absence. I set the phone face down, but the message burned through the table like heat through glass. The divorce had taken more than the house and savings. It had taken my reflection out of the picture. For decades, I'd been the quiet half of someone else's story, the accompanist, never the soloist. Across the room, my violin case leaned against a box labeled music. I hadn't opened it since the final court date. My left hand still remembered the feel of the strings, the callus of practice that once marked me as someone with purpose. I tried to imagine tuning it again, but the sound in my head came out thin and uncertain. A car horn blared outside, snapping me back. I turned on the small kitchen light, its hum soft but human. That's when I noticed the envelope wedged under the front door. I thought it was another bill until I saw the return address Defense Intelligence Estate Division. My first instinct was to toss it aside, mistaken identity junk anything but real. But the name typed beneath mine stopped me cold. Captain Walter Locke, my grandfather. He died when I was a teenager, a quiet man who smelled of pipe tobacco and engine oil. My mother always said he played piano during the war, entertaining officers. I never asked more than that. The family didn't talk about him much, as if the silence itself were part of his legacy. I slit the envelope open with a butter knife. Inside was a formal notice printed on heavy paper. This letter serves as official notification regarding the unclaimed compensation of Captain Walter Locke, U.S. Army, related to Operation Silent Key, 1959. Contact within 72 hours for verification and guidance. Below a number and signature, Cole James Hughes, Joint Base Charleston. I read it twice. It felt absurd, like a bureaucratic ghost had chosen the worst possible day to find me. Still, my hand shook as I folded the letter back into its envelope. The apartment had grown darker. I turned toward the window, where the horizon flared orange one last time before sinking into night. My phone buzzed again, and for a heartbeat, I hoped it was Kendra. It wasn't. The screen flashed a message I didn't recognize: Private U.S. Department of Defense. And before I could think of reasons not to, I pressed accept. Rain began tapping against the window as I lifted the phone to my ear. Mrs. Locke. The voice was firm, clipped, and unmistakably military. "This is Colonel James Hughes from the Department of Defense Estate Recovery Division. I apologize for the hour, but it's imperative I speak with you directly." For a moment, I said nothing. The kettle hissed on the stove, filling the silence. "You're calling about my grandfather," I finally managed. "Captain Walter Locke." "Yes, ma'am," he replied, his tone softening slightly. "You received our notice today?" I looked down at the open envelope on the table, the letter half soaked by a stray drop of tea. "I did. But I think there's been a mistake. My grandfather died over 40 years ago. He didn't have anything left to recover." "That's where you're wrong," Hughes said. "Your grandfather participated in a classified operation during the Cold War codename Project Silent Key. Certain assets connected to that mission were never claimed. Now that the file has been declassified, we're required by law to locate the rightful heir." Assets. The word sat heavy in the air. "You mean money compensation," he corrected. "But not a typical inheritance. It's complex, Mrs. Locke, and confidential. The operation was sealed under national security for 6 decades. Now that the restrictions expired, your signature is needed to verify his estate." I walked to the window. The reflection in the glass showed a woman I barely recognized. Shoulders hunched, hair graying at the temples, eyes dimmed by disbelief. "Why me?" I asked quietly. "My mother's gone. My daughter barely speaks to me. I'm nobody." Hughes paused long enough that I could hear the faint buzz of a radio behind him. "Captain Locke listed you personally," he said. His exact wording was, "To my granddaughter Marian, the only one who still hears the music." The words reached somewhere I hadn't touched in years. "He was a musician," I whispered. "So were you," Hughes said. "That's why you're the key?" I sank into the chair by the window. "Colonel, I don't understand. I'm not part of any government file. I teach children to play violin. That's all I've ever done." He didn't answer right away. When he spoke again, his voice carried something close to empathy. "Mrs. Locke, your grandfather was more than a pianist in officers' clubs. His service record was a cover. He was part of a specialized intelligence unit, cryptographic operations embedded in Southeast Asia. His skill was in coding and decoding information through musical notation. He developed systems our analysts still study. Lightning flashed over the harbor, whitening the room. You're telling me my grandfather was a spy? I'm telling you he was a patriot, Hughes said evenly, and a man who made certain decisions that shaped more lives than you might imagine. We can discuss the details at a secure facility. I've scheduled a preliminary briefing for tomorrow 9 a.m., Joint Base Charleston. Transportation will be arranged. I rubbed the corner of the envelope, tracing my name. You tracked me down just for this. After 60 years. Not just for this. For timing. He hesitated. Captain Locke left instructions specifying when contact should be made. My hand froze. Instructions? Yes, ma'am. His file notes. Contact my granddaughter on the day she has nothing left to lose. Outside, thunder rolled over the bay, a low rumble that seemed to rise from somewhere beneath my ribs. For a second, I couldn't breathe. Hughes continued, his voice almost gentle. He believed you'd understand what that meant when the time came. The call ended soon after. I stood there listening to the rain, the sound steady as a metronome each drop, counting down to something I didn't yet know. On the table, the letter waited beside my untouched tea, and above it my phone screen still glowed. Private, Department of Defense. Tomorrow I would have to decide whether to answer it again. The next morning, the rain had lifted, but left behind a sky the color of pewter. I drove north along Highway 17, the old road that wound past marshes and crumbling plantations toward my late mother's house in Mount Pleasant. I hadn't been there since the funeral 3 years ago. The property had sat empty ever since, the front gate sagging on its hinges, Spanish moss curling from the oaks like a memory that refused to die. I still had the key. The door stuck before it opened, releasing a stale breath of air mixed with dust and the faint sweetness of cedar. The furniture was draped in sheets, each shape familiar: the upright piano by the window, the worn rug where I'd practiced as a girl. I set my purse down and stood for a moment, letting the quiet settle around me. Mother had kept everything. Even after she grew forgetful near the end, she wouldn't throw away a single photograph, a single envelope. Somewhere in this house, if Colonel Hughes was right, lay whatever secret my grandfather had buried 60 years ago. The attic stairs creaked under my weight. I pushed open the small door at the top, and a cloud of dust bloomed in the shaft of light from the single round window. The smell of old paper oil and mothballs hit me all at once. I remembered following my mother up here when I was little, holding her hand while she pulled down Christmas decorations. I started searching through boxes stacked against the rafters, old sheet music Army Trunks family albums. Then I saw it, a small cedar chest with a tarnished brass latch. Across the lid, my mother's handwriting in faded marker read, W. Locke. Music. I crouched beside it, brushing away cobwebs, before opening the latch. Inside lay a neat stack of yellowed manuscript paper bound with string. Beneath the top sheet rested a leather notebook and a folded note, the paper brittle with age. The note was short, written in my grandfather's careful script. For Marian, when music no longer pays the rent. I sat back on my heels. The words struck deeper than they should have. Somehow he'd known. I untied the string and lifted the first sheet of music. It was a piano sonata, simple, unassuming, but something felt off. In several measures, the rests had been altered, extended by strange increments, and there were faint pencil marks between the bars, letters, notations that didn't belong. My eye followed one line, GABBD, a pattern that looked like gibberish, until I noticed it formed a rhythm of 3s and 7s like coded timing. Grandfather's secret. I carried the bundle downstairs to the living room and laid it across the piano. The keys were stiff out of tune, but when I pressed a few, the sound echoed through the empty house like a ghost testing its voice. I played through the first page slowly, letting the unfamiliar sequence unfold. Between the melody, I began to hear something hidden. Pauses that didn't feel musical intervals that suggested structure more than emotion. I stopped halfway through and looked closer at the margins. Along the top staff line, faint pencil words spelled out Fugue 1959, Night Key, Silent Key. My pulse quickened. Could this be what Hughes meant? I turned to the next sheet. More letters ran along the margins, so faint they nearly disappeared in the paper's yellow. Each composition was dated in a tight script, March 7, 1959, May 12, 1960, August 3, 1961. Everyone corresponded to years my mother never spoke about. I flipped open the leather notebook at the bottom of the box. Inside were practice logs, but the pages shifted midway to dense columns of numbers and abbreviations, the handwriting tightening as if someone were racing against time. I played one more chord. It hung in the air, unsteady, unresolved, then faded into silence. Outside, a breeze rattled the shutters, scattering dust into the light. I looked around the empty room and suddenly felt him there, as if the air itself had been waiting for me to come back and listen properly. I gathered the scores into my bag, sealed the chest, and locked the door behind me. For the first time in years, I felt a reason to keep driving forward. The next morning, I arrived at Joint Base Charleston, just after sunrise. The guard at the front gate checked my license twice before handing me a temporary badge. A convoy of military trucks passed beyond the fence, their engines low and steady, while gulls wheeled over the gray water behind them. The air smelled of salt and fuel. A young officer escorted me through a maze of corridors until we stopped at a door marked "Confidential Access Only." He swiped his ID, and the lock released with a click. Colonel Hughes stood waiting inside. He was tall, in his mid-50s perhaps, with a posture that made the word discipline look effortless. The room itself was small and spare metal table, 2 chairs, a sealed folder, and a pot of coffee that smelled freshly made. "Mrs. Locke," he said, offering his hand. "I appreciate you coming on such short notice." "I'm not sure what else I was supposed to do," I replied. "You made it sound urgent." He gestured for me to sit. "It is. But before we begin, I need to verify your identity." He asked a series of questions: date of birth, mother's maiden name, last known address of Captain Walter Locke. Each answer I gave seemed to ease something in his expression, though his tone stayed measured. Finally, he opened the folder. "Your grandfather served as a cryptographic specialist from 1957 to 1961, he began. "Officially, his record lists him as a pianist for officer morale programs in Southeast Asia." That was the cover story. In reality, he was part of a joint intelligence project known as Operation Silent Key. He slid a photograph across the table, 6 men in fatigues standing beside a field tent. One of them, tall with familiar eyes, was Walter Locke. "Silent Key," I repeated quietly. "That name was written on his music sheets." Hughes nodded. "Then you've already found what we hoped you would." Those compositions were his encryption system, melodic ciphers. Every tempo change, every rest represented numeric sequences used to transmit information. He developed them to move intelligence through neutral channels disguised as ordinary sheet music. I stared at the photo again. My grandfather had always been so quiet, so ordinary. To imagine him as part of this world, a world of secrets and invisible loyalties, felt almost impossible. "What happened to him?" I asked. "His team intercepted a Soviet communication relay in Cambodia in 1959, Hughes said. "He secured certain databank transfers, payment codes. But before he could deliver it to Washington, his unit was compromised. He went dark for 6 months. When he resurfaced, he refused to reveal what he'd found, claimed the information was too dangerous. The file was sealed, and the funds meant for him were frozen under classified compensation." I exhaled slowly. "And now you want me to claim it?" "Not exactly." He folded his hands. "The assets were set aside under his name and indexed for inflation. They've grown substantially over 6 decades. But the department can only release them under one condition: completion of his posthumous verification protocol. He designed it himself." "A test." Hughes inclined his head. "In a manner of speaking. He left instructions in your possession, presumably within his music. The protocol gives you 72 hours to interpret and locate one specific data file, something he referred to as the ledger. Once authenticated, the inheritance transfers automatically." I rubbed my palms together, trying to find steady ground. "You're telling me my grandfather left a riddle inside his music, and if I solve it, I inherit a fortune?" "It's not a riddle," Hughes said. "It's proof that you are, as he described, the only one who still hears the music." He pushed a digital recorder across the table. "This device will log your progress. You're free to contact me if you feel unsafe. But we cannot assist in deciphering the material. That would violate the terms of the protocol." I looked down at the recorder, then at his calm, unreadable face. "Why now?" I asked. "Why wait 60 years? Hughes closed the folder. "Because the classification expired last week," he said. "And because your grandfather requested that we contact you only when you had nothing left to lose." The words echoed the same line he'd spoken over the phone, but hearing them in that room felt different, colder, truer. I gathered the papers, the recorder, and the photograph. When I stepped back into the hallway, the hum of the bass filled the air engines, starting orders shouted the rhythm of precision. For a brief moment, it almost sounded like music. That night, I spread my grandfather's scores across the dining table. The air in the apartment felt dense, like something unseen was waiting to surface. The only light came from a small desk lamp, its glow pooling over the yellowed pages. I had spent most of the evening trying to calm my hands. I told myself this was just curiosity, not obsession. But the truth was, something inside me had already shifted. Colonel Hughes's words echoed the only one who still hears the music. The first piece I studied was titled Fugue in D minor, 1959. At first glance, it looked like any classical composition measured precise, but there were oddities. Every few bars he'd penciled faint letters above the staff, A-G-E-D, repeated in strange combinations. The tempo markings also seemed inconsistent, not the usual andante or allegro, but numbers 72, 118, 47, each circled twice in red. I fetched my old metronome from the shelf, wound it, and let its steady click fill the room. 72 beats per minute, then 118. I wrote the numbers on a pad beside me. The shift wasn't musical, it was mathematical. I turned to the next page. In the upper margin, a note appeared faintly in graphite bar numbers equal coordinates. My breath caught. I counted the bars on the first line, 32, then the next 17. On the following page, he'd underlined a pair of digits, 32 degree and 17 degree. I opened my laptop and typed the numbers into a map. Savannah, Georgia. The docks. A chill swept through me, the kind that starts at the spine and radiates outward. I scrolled further, tracing the shoreline on the map. The coordinates matched a section of the old Navy Yard, a part of the port, long decommissioned and fenced off. I sat back in the chair, staring at the screen. My grandfather hadn't written music. He'd drawn directions. It was midnight, and the rain had started again, light but relentless. The steady tapping on the window sounded like a second metronome, counting the distance between me and whatever waited on that coast. I poured myself coffee, though I didn't need the caffeine. The adrenaline had already taken hold. I examined the next composition, Nocturne, 1960. This one carried longer rests, unusual pauses that disrupted the rhythm. I remembered Colonel Hughes saying Walter had used musical rests as encryption intervals. Each pause a break in sound, but not in meaning. I took out a pencil and began noting the sequence long rest, short rest, double pause. When I translated them into Morse equivalents dash dot, something began to emerge, a word, S-A-V-A-N-N-A-H. I dropped the pencil, laughing softly, though there was no joy in it. It was disbelief wrapped in awe. All my life I had taught music as structure emotion language, and now I was seeing it for what my grandfather had made it camouflage. The sound of thunder cracked in the distance, followed by the hiss of tires outside. I rose, checking the window, half expecting someone to be there. But the street was empty. The world kept moving, indifferent to the revelation blooming in my living room. I gathered the papers, carefully arranging them back into sequence. At the bottom of one sheet, nearly invisible under the smudge of time, was another note in my grandfather's hand. Follow the low tide. Look for what can't be buried. I folded the page gently, slipping it into my bag. It was nearly 2 a.m. when I turned off the lamp. The apartment felt different now, alive with quiet purpose. Somewhere in Savannah, something my grandfather had hidden for 60 years was waiting to be found. I locked the door behind me, the echo of rain still in my ears, and began planning the drive south. The Savannah docks smelled of salt and rust when I arrived the next afternoon. The sky was low and heavy, the kind of gray that presses against your chest. I parked near the chain-link fence that marked the old Navy yard long abandoned, except for a few warehouses leaning toward the sea. According to the coordinates from my grandfather's music, the place I needed was Building 47B. The sign still hung over the door, its paint cracked and flaking. A padlock sealed the entrance, but it wasn't new. It looked untouched for decades. The air was damp as I searched through my bag for the key Colonel Hughes had given me. He'd said it would open an archived military storage facility related to my grandfather's service record. Nothing more. The brass key fit perfectly. When I turned it, the lock gave with a sound like a breath released after too many years. Inside the warehouse was colder than I expected. The faint echo of my footsteps bounced against metal walls. Dust floated in slow spirals through the slanted beams of light that filtered from a broken skylight. The floor was scattered with crates stacked haphazardly and marked with serial numbers. In the center stood one metal cabinet, olive green and pristine among the decay. On its front panel, a small placard read, "Property of U.S. Navy Intelligence, 1960. I hesitated before opening it. My grandfather's music had led me here. The least I could do was open the final note. The cabinet creaked as it swung wide. Inside, neatly arranged on 2 shelves, were sealed envelopes, a few reels of microfilm, and 3 bound ledgers. The first envelope contained a typed memorandum dated June 4th, 1959. It confirmed what Colonel Hughes had hinted at Operation Silent Key, had intercepted Soviet communications, detailing secret transactions between American defense contractors and foreign intermediaries. I pulled one of the ledgers closer. The cover was embossed in faded gold Union Bank of Switzerland, confidential holdings. The pages within were filled with columns of numbers, signatures, and company names. Some were familiar Ashcroft Industries, Dalmer Aviation, Hayworth Dynamics. Each entry listed a transaction, an amount, and a code that looked like an account identifier. The handwriting in the margins was unmistakably my grandfather's. He had circled certain names, written notes in tiny script. Fatal batch defective rotors, 22 confirmed casualties. My stomach clenched. These weren't ordinary payments. They were bribes and cover-ups. Companies that had supplied faulty helicopter parts to the U.S., military parts that killed soldiers, and then sold the same information to Soviet buyers for profit. I touched the ink with my fingertips, half expecting it to smear, but it had long since set permanent as truth itself. At the back of the cabinet was a small metal box. Inside lay a reel of microfilm labeled Silent Key, Final Transmission. The label was dated 1 week before Walter Locke vanished in 1959. He must have hidden this before he went dark. I slid the film into the light from the window and could make out lines of typed reports, blurred names, coordinates, casualty counts. The paper shook slightly in my hands, not from the cold, but from what it meant. My grandfather hadn't buried treasure. He'd buried guilt, evidence of corruption so large it could break families and careers even decades later. Outside waves hit the dock pilings in steady rhythm. I gathered the ledgers and microfilm into my bag, locked the cabinet again, and stepped into the daylight. The breeze off the river was sharp, cutting through the humid air. Somewhere above, gulls cried over the empty port, their voices sharp and restless, as if echoing the weight of what I carried away. I didn't drive home that night. My hands were trembling too badly for the wheel, and the storm rolling in from the coast made the road shimmer like glass. I found a small roadside motel off I-95, one of those places where the neon sign flickers between vacancy and darkness. The room smelled faintly of bleach and damp carpet. I didn't care. I just needed walls and a lock. The ledgers and microfilm were spread across the motel desk like contraband. I tried not to look at them too long. Each page felt radioactive. Every time I blinked, I saw the words, Hayworth Dynamics, burned behind my eyelids. It couldn't be coincidence. My daughter's fiancé, Andrew Hayworth, the charming heir to the Hayworth manufacturing empire, was part of that family. They'd been in defense contracts for generations. His name had appeared at Kendra's engagement dinner just last month, spoken with reverence by everyone at the table. I remembered smiling politely while the conversation circled around their foundation donations and humanitarian projects. No one mentioned the bodies buried under their money. The motel heater rattled to life. I tried calling Colonel Hughes, but the signal was weak. Straight to voicemail. I left a short message, something calm enough not to sound afraid. Then I locked the ledgers in my suitcase, set it beside the bed, and turned out the light. Sleep never came. At 2:17 a.m., my phone vibrated on the nightstand. Unknown number. I answered without thinking. Mrs. Locke, a man's voice, said smooth and precise as if every syllable had been practiced. I hope you'll forgive the hour. I wanted to make sure you understand what you're holding. I sat up slowly. Who is this? You've found material that belongs to the Department of Defense, he continued, ignoring the question. Let's not pretend otherwise. You'll receive an official offer. Soon accept it. Take the compensation and walk away. No one needs to know about the rest. My throat tightened. You're not from the Pentagon. A low chuckle. No, but I'm from a family your grandfather knew well. The name Hayworth should sound familiar. I gripped the phone harder. What do you want to keep you safe? He said lightly, and to keep certain histories from bleeding into the present. Think of your daughter, Mrs. Locke. She's engaged to my nephew, a good man with a promising future. You wouldn't want his name or hers tangled in old scandals. He paused, as if giving me space to picture Kendra's face, her life unraveling. There's a clean option for everyone, he went on. Accept the Pentagon's payout, sign a non-disclosure, and destroy what you found in Savannah. You'll be wealthy beyond concern. Kendra can marry into stability, and this chapter closes where it began, with silence. The calmness in his tone chilled me more than any threat could. He wasn't bluffing. He was accustomed to being obeyed. Who told you I found anything? I asked. Let's just say your grandfather's work is still of interest to certain people, and you've made yourself visible. The line went dead. I stared at the phone screen until it dimmed, then set it face down beside the bed. The storm outside had reached the motel, now rain pelting against the window in frantic bursts. In the silence between thunderclaps, I could still hear his voice, smooth, patient, confident, that I'd do the reasonable thing. But he didn't know me. And he didn't know that the one thing I had left was the truth, and I was done trading it for comfort. By the next morning, I was already driving north, the Savannah sky behind me, still bruised from the storm. The suitcase lay in the back seat like a passenger I didn't trust. Each mile toward Washington felt heavier, as though the road itself were bending under the weight of what I carried. I called my cousin Ellen before crossing into Virginia. We hadn't spoken in years, not since my mother's funeral, but I knew she'd stayed in D.C. working as a defense correspondent for the Chronicle. She answered on the second ring, her voice calm and quick, the way it always had been when she was chasing a lead. Marian. That's a name from another lifetime. What's going on? I need your help, I said. And I need your discretion. She didn't ask questions right away. Maybe she heard something in my tone that told her this wasn't small. By the time I reached the city, she'd cleared a space for me in her office, a narrow corner room with stacks of classified briefings and the faint smell of burnt coffee. She stood as I entered, her short silver hair, pulled back glasses slipping down her nose. You look like you haven't slept. I haven't, I said simply, setting the suitcase on her desk. What I'm about to show you is dangerous. Her eyebrows rose, but she didn't interrupt. I opened the case and laid out the ledgers, the microfilm reels and the typed memorandum from 1959. She leaned forward, scanning the pages as if reading music, her journalist's instincts switching on. Where did you get these? They were hidden in a Navy storage site in Savannah, I said. My grandfather was part of something called Operation Silent Key. I think these documents are what he died protecting. Ellen adjusted her glasses, flipping through the pages. Good Lord. These are Swiss accounts. And these names, Dalmer Aviation, Hayworth Dynamics, Ashcroft Industries. These companies are still active. I've written about them. She paused, running her fingers over a handwritten note in the margin, fatal batch rotor assembly. Her voice lowered. This looks like evidence of defective helicopter components supplied to the military. The casualties. These numbers match reports from Southeast Asia in 1960. We always assumed mechanical error. I watched her expression harden her focus, sharpening into the precision I remembered from childhood. Ellen dissecting truth as if it were a living organism. Can it be verified? I asked quietly. Absolutely, she said, already pulling her laptop closer. We'll cross-reference the casualty reports with procurement contracts from that era. If this is real, it's not just negligence. It's fraud and war crimes. For the next few hours, the hum of the newsroom faded around us. She typed cross-checked, printed, and circled. At one point, she called in a contact from the Department of Veterans Affairs who owed her a favor. Within minutes, casualty lists arrived: pilots and crewmen who died in helicopter failures between 1959 and 1961. The numbers matched almost perfectly with my grandfather's annotations. Ellen sat back, exhaling. He documented everything. This isn't the work of a spy trying to profit. It's the work of a man trying to preserve proof when everyone else wanted it erased. I stared at the screen, the list of names scrolling endlessly. Each one represented a family that never got an answer. Ellen turned toward me. You realize what happens if this goes public? These companies are embedded in current defense projects. The Hayworths still hold contracts with the Navy. Your daughter's future husband, his family, will be at the center of this. My throat tightened. I know. Then you also know, she said softly. This could ruin her. I looked at the documents spread across the table, the truth glowing under fluorescent light. Somewhere deep inside, I felt my grandfather's silence again, not cowardice this time, but calculation. He'd waited for someone to choose when to break it. Ellen reached across the table and touched my hand. If we move forward, we do it carefully. I'll protect your name. But once it's out there, it can't be undone. I nodded. Do it anyway. She gave a small, grim smile. You sound like him. When I left the newsroom that evening, the city lights had already come on the streets alive with their own restless rhythm. I walked past the Lincoln Memorial, its reflection trembling in the water, and thought of the names on Ellen's screen, men who'd never been memorialized, their deaths written off as mechanical failure. For the first time, I understood what my grandfather had meant when he wrote, "When music no longer pays the rent, play for truth instead." The sky over Washington was still dark when I unlocked the practice room at Ellen's townhouse. She had offered me her piano and her silence, both of which I needed. The room smelled faintly of cedar and ink. Sheet music covered the floor like fallen leaves, copies of my grandfather's scores, some originals already too fragile to touch. I hadn't slept since the night before. Every sound in my head felt sharp, electric, as if music itself were holding its breath. Somewhere in those notes I knew lay the final piece of his design. I sat at the piano, first tracing the edges of one composition labeled Requiem in Summer. It was dated August 1961, the last entry before Walter Locke disappeared. The paper was brittle and spotted, but the writing remained deliberate, confident. The time signature was irregular 3-4, then 5-4, alternating, as though two hearts beat out of sync. At the top margin, he had written, "Barely visible. The key is not in sound, but in silence." I switched to my violin. The strings felt colder than usual against my fingertips, the rosin dry from disuse. As I drew the bow across the first note, the melody rose thin and uncertain, like memory itself, testing its strength. The rhythm fought me. It wasn't meant to be beautiful. It was meant to mean something. I slowed the tempo, matching each rest to the patterns I had decoded before. The sequence formed digits. Ellen, who had stayed awake beside me with her laptop, began typing them in quietly, her fingers steady. "Coordinates again?" she asked. "Not this time," I murmured. "It's shorter 6 numbers grouped like an account." I kept playing. A sudden shift in the melody pulled the phrase upward before dropping abruptly into silence. I held the bow midair, then lowered it to the string again, following instinct. The next section repeated the same interval, but inverted as if reflecting itself. When I transcribed those bars and translated the spacing into letters, the code revealed a single phrase, UBS Geneva 47289. Ellen looked up sharply. UBS Union Bank of Switzerland. That's where most of these accounts trace back to. My pulse quickened. So this piece, it's the password. She hesitated, then opened a secure banking verification site through her press credentials. Her contact at the financial desk owed her another favor. Within minutes, she was speaking softly into her phone in French, confirming archival account access. When she hung up, her face had gone pale. "Marian, it's real. The account exists frozen untouched since 1961, and it's active under your grandfather's estate authorization." How much she turned the screen toward me. The balance exceeded 80 million untouched since 1961. For a moment, all sound fell away. I could only hear the pulse in my ears steady as a metronome. My grandfather had preserved every cent of the blood money he'd exposed but never spent. I lifted the bow again, unable to stop myself. The melody moved through me slower this time, like something alive finding breath after decades underground. The notes shifted in the air, bright and mournful, all at once. When I reached the final bar, I realized what he had done. The last phrase spelled the word Amen in musical notation. A, then 2 measures of rest, then E, then N, represented by the natural sign. It wasn't just an ending, it was absolution. Ellen leaned back, exhaling. He built the key into the one thing he trusted, his art. I nodded, setting down the violin. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. He must have known it would take another musician to unlock it. Outside dawn began bleeding over the rooftops, the first light in days that didn't feel heavy. The room smelled faintly of ozone and old paper, like a storm had just passed. Ellen closed the laptop and looked at me quietly. "So what now?" I stared at the violin resting across my knees, the strings still humming from the last note. "Now," I said, "we decide what the truth is worth." By evening, the air in Washington felt sharp and metallic. Ellen had gone home to rest, promising to contact a trusted legal advisor in the morning, while I drove her borrowed car toward the small apartment she'd arranged for me near Capitol Hill. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, more out of instinct than paranoia. But halfway through the underground parking garage, I realized the same black sedan had followed me since the last intersection. I slowed. So did it. The sound of tires on concrete filled the space, deliberate and slow. When I turned left, the car turned too. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered in uneven rhythm, painting the cement walls in alternating stripes of shadow and glare. My pulse began to climb. I accelerated, suddenly, took a sharp corner, and pulled into a narrow space near the stairwell. The sedan passed once silent, except for the low hum of its engine, then disappeared around the next curve. I waited a full minute before unlocking the door. The garage was still. The only sound was the faint drip of water from a leaking pipe. As I stepped out, the smell of exhaust and oil wrapped around me. My nerves were still thrumming when I saw it tucked beneath my windshield wiper, a small white envelope. No stamp, no handwriting on the front. Just a clean fold. My fingers shook as I opened it. Inside, one line typed neatly on plain paper. Mothers who love their daughters, keep quiet. For a second, I couldn't move. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead, too bright, too sterile. The words seemed to pulse on the page, cruel in their simplicity. Kendra's face flashed through my mind the way she'd looked the last time I saw her, all expensive confidence and the faint, practiced smile she reserved for public moments. I could almost hear her laughter from childhood echoing faintly under this cold light. I took a breath, forcing my voice steady, as I snapped a photo of the note with my phone. Then I called Colonel Hughes. He answered on the second ring. Mrs. Locke. "They've found me," I said. "Someone's been watching since Savannah. I just got a threat." A pause. "Read it to me." I did. The line sounded worse, spoken aloud. Hughes didn't raise his voice. "Do not go upstairs. Leave the garage. Drive directly to the base. I'll have someone meet you at the north gate. We'll arrange temporary housing until this is handled. I'm not running again." "This isn't running," he said evenly. "It's staying alive long enough to finish what your grandfather started." I hesitated, my hand still gripping the car door. "They know about Kendra. They're using her to keep me quiet." "That's their leverage," he said. "They'll try to make you choose between silence and family. Don't let them. The Bureau is already aware of the investigation. You're not alone in this." The weight of exhaustion settled on me, then heavier than fear. I wanted to believe him, to believe that the government could protect an aging music teacher caught in a web of old crimes. But part of me knew this was larger than any agency could contain. I slid back into the driver's seat, locking the doors. My reflection in the rearview mirror looked like someone else's face, drawn tight, eyes too bright. When I pulled out of the garage, I checked the mirror again. The sedan was gone, but the unease it left behind clung like smoke. The city outside seemed sharper. Now the monuments gleaming white under the streetlights, the wind off the Potomac slicing cold against the windshield. Every traffic light felt like a spotlight, every shadow like an audience waiting for me to miss a cue. I drove until the streets began to thin, until the lights gave way to darkness, and the sound of my own breathing steadied. Somewhere between the rhythm of the tires and the echo of Hughes's words, I realized something simple and terrible. They weren't just warning me to stop. They were daring me to continue. The rain began before dusk, the kind that slanted sideways and drummed against the windows as if it were trying to get in. I'd been sitting at the kitchen table for an hour, phone beside me, waiting. Hughes had moved me into a temporary apartment near DuPont Circle, secure, quiet, anonymous. The suitcase with the ledgers sat by the door like a silent guard. When the knock came, it wasn't tentative. It was sharp, impatient. I knew that rhythm even before I opened the door. Kendra stood in the hallway, her hair damp from the rain makeup smudged under her eyes. She looked like she hadn't slept either. Behind her, a black car idled at the curb, its headlights cutting through the downpour. "Can I come in?" she asked flatly. I stepped aside. "You already have." She brushed past me, pacing once through the room before turning to face me. "You've been talking to reporters." Her voice was controlled, but it trembled at the edges. "Ellen sent me a message. She said you're planning to release some investigation that involves the Hayworth family. Do you realize what you're doing?" I kept my tone calm. "I know exactly what I'm doing." Kendra's laugh came out brittle. "You're destroying my life. That's what you're doing. Andrew's family is panicking. His father called off the engagement dinner. They said there's some kind of smear campaign. They think it's you." "It isn't a smear if it's true," I said, quietly. She froze, the air between us thickening. "True?" I walked to the suitcase, unzipped it, and placed the first ledger on the table. The pages glowed faintly under the kitchen light. "Your great-grandfather found evidence of companies that supplied defective parts to the U.S. Army rotors. Turbines, things that failed mid-flight. Soldiers died. And one of those companies was Hayworth Dynamics." Her face drained of color. "That's impossible." "It isn't. These are the transaction records, the technical notes, the casualty lists. The money was funneled through Swiss accounts for decades. The Hayworths made their fortune on it and buried everyone who tried to speak." Kendra shook her head, backing away. "No. Andrew's father runs charities for veterans. They donate millions. With blood money," I said. My voice cracked, then not with anger, but exhaustion. "Your grandfather tried to expose it. They silenced him. And now they want me to do the same." For a moment, all I heard was the storm outside the gutter, overflowing thunder rolling like distant artillery. Kendra stood motionless, her reflection trembling in the rain-streaked window. "You're saying Andrew's family is responsible for people dying," she whispered. "I'm saying the truth doesn't disappear just because it's inconvenient," I said. "You deserve to know what kind of name you were about to marry into." She pressed a hand to her mouth, and when she finally spoke again, her voice was small. "You could have told me privately. You didn't have to make this public." "I tried to protect you," I said. "But they threatened you. They left a note on my car. Mothers who love their daughters keep quiet. Do you think silence protects anyone?" Her eyes met mine, full of something raw, fear, disbelief, maybe grief. "So this is about revenge?" "No," I said softly. "It's about justice." She walked to the table, her fingers trembling as she turned one of the pages. Names filled the column: pilots, mechanics, engineers. Her breath hitched when she reached the annotation. "Fatal batch confirmed 1960 Savannah-Ket Airfield." "I don't want this to be true," she whispered. "Neither did he," I said, nodding toward the photo of my grandfather I'd left on the mantel. "But pretending otherwise doesn't bring anyone back." Kendra sank into the nearest chair. Her tears came suddenly, silently at first, then with the force of years she'd spent trying to be strong for a world that rewarded denial. I stood beside her, uncertain whether to touch her shoulder. She reached for my hand before I could decide. "I don't know what to do," she said. "Then start by believing it?" I answered. We sat together as the storm thickened the city lights outside, smearing into ribbons of gold and gray. For the first time in a long while, she didn't pull away. The thunder rolled again, low and unending, and I realized it sounded almost like the sea, the same rhythm that had followed me since Charleston. Rising, falling, waiting for silence to finally break. Morning sunlight glared off the glass walls of the Pentagon's East Wing, sharp enough to make me squint as I followed Colonel Hughes down the corridor. The air smelled faintly of paper and metal polish, every sound absorbed by the weight of protocol. My reflection flashed across the steel doors as we entered a conference room that looked more like a courtroom long table government seals, two silent aides waiting by the wall. Hughes gestured for me to sit. "The department has completed verification of Captain Walter Locke's estate," he said, opening a thick folder. "The assets are legitimate and legally transferable. You are the sole beneficiary." I stared at the folder. Not at him. "All $155 million, I murmured. The number didn't sound real. It hung in the air like a note too high to reach. Before we proceed, Hughes continued, "I need your directive for disbursement. You're entitled to take full possession, but you indicated another option during our last call." I handed him the envelope I'd written the night before. The handwriting was careful, steady. "Half of it goes into a trust," I said. "For veterans' families, especially those affected by aviation losses from 1959 to 1961. The rest can remain under my name, invested to sustain the fund." Hughes opened the letter and read silently. His expression didn't change, but there was something in his eyes, respect perhaps, or fatigue. "You're aware this makes the matter public, at least in part. We'll need a statement." "I understand," I said. "But it's not about exposure. It's correction. My grandfather didn't die to make me rich." He nodded once, then slid another folder across the table. "The controlled disclosure will begin next week. We'll release partial details acknowledgement of fraud, no classified material. The full investigation will follow through civilian channels." I signed the documents where he pointed my pen scraping faintly against the heavy paper. When it was done, he stood and offered his hand. "You've honored his legacy, Mrs. Locke. Not many would have chosen this path." "Maybe not," I said. "But he left me a compass, not a fortune." As I left the building, the corridors seemed quieter than before. Outside, the glare softened into morning haze, and for the first time in months, I felt the ground beneath me steady, like a note that had finally found its chord. The press room at the Pentagon was colder than I expected. Rows of cameras faced the stage, their red recording lights glowing like watchful eyes. Reporters murmured into microphones, their words, fragments of static and speculation. Behind the podium, the seal of the Department of Defense gleamed under the harsh lights. Colonel Hughes stood beside me, his uniform immaculate, his expression unreadable. He'd briefed me on what to expect, questions I could answer. Those I couldn't. The government's legal team had scripted an official statement, but he'd allowed me to add one line of my own. That was all I needed. When the room settled, he stepped forward first. "This morning, the Department of Defense, in cooperation with independent investigators, confirms the declassification of material relating to Operation Silent Key, active between 1957 and 1961. The findings detail corporate misconduct linked to defective military equipment supplied during that period. Further legal proceedings are now underway." 100 flashbulbs went off at once. I could feel the heat of them on my face, even before Hughes turned toward me. "Mrs. Marian Locke, granddaughter of Captain Walter Locke, will make a brief statement." The walk to the podium felt longer than any stage I had ever crossed. I had played concerts before thousands, but no performance had ever carried this kind of weight. I set my notes down, though I didn't look at them. My grandfather spent his life making music. I began my voice steady, but quiet. He believed silence could protect people, and for a long time it did. It kept our family safe. It kept others from asking questions that might have cost them their lives. I paused, the cameras clicking like a restless rhythm section. But silence also allowed certain truths to rot beneath the surface. Truths that cost good men and women everything. The files released today are not just about money or history. They're about accountability. My grandfather once wrote, "When the music stops, all that remains is the echo of what we chose not to say." I looked out over the crowd. Ellen stood in the back arms, crossed a press badge clipped to her coat. She had spent the night finalizing her article. The Chronicle would publish the full story within minutes of this briefing: names, transactions, casualty records, everything verified and sourced. "Silence saved our lives," I said. Finally, my throat tightening. "But truth may save our souls." The words landed in the stillness. Then the questions came all at once, shouts overlapping cameras, swiveling flashes, exploding. I stepped back, leaving Hughes to handle the chaos. By the time I reached the side door, my phone was already vibrating. Ellen's message came first: "It's live." In less than an hour, every major outlet had picked up her story. Screens across the Capitol blazed with the headline, "War Profits and Lies the Silent Key Files." Markets dipped before noon. Hayworth Dynamics halted trading entirely. Congressional aides scrambled down hallways as subpoenas began circulating. By evening, 2 executives had resigned, and the Justice Department confirmed a criminal inquiry. I watched it unfold from Ellen's office, the city outside, flickering with sirens and camera lights. She stood beside me, her phone buzzing nonstop. "It's everywhere," she said. "They can't bury it now." On the television, a familiar image appeared: Kendra, stepping out of her fiancé's townhouse, reporters surrounding her. She said nothing, just pushed through the crowd, face pale under the rain. I turned away. Ellen lowered the volume. "She'll come around," she murmured. I didn't answer. I was thinking of my grandfather instead, the way his hands had hovered over the piano keys, the pauses between his chords more powerful than the notes themselves. He had always known when to stop playing. Outside the window, Washington shimmered in the wet light of evening, a city built on secrets, now echoing with truth. For the first time in 60 years, his silence had finally ended, and its music was everywhere. By the time the indictments were announced, the rain had turned to sleet in Washington. News vans crowded the entrance of Hayworth Industries, their antennae stabbing into the gray sky. Reporters shouted questions that vanished under the hum of engines and the metallic click of camera shutters. The company's flag, usually pristine, hung limp in the wind. From across the street, I watched the glass doors burst open as 2 executives were escorted out, faces pale, jackets pulled tight, their silence doing nothing to protect them now. The Justice Department had moved quickly. Ellen had told me the subpoenas went out overnight. What had started as a single article had become a national reckoning. Inside, the board meeting had collapsed into chaos. Shareholders demanded resignations, contracts were frozen, and the Hayworth name, once synonymous with wealth and respectability, was now shorthand for betrayal. Kendra called that afternoon. Her voice cracked before she even said my name. "It's over," she whispered. "I know," I said softly. "They've canceled everything, the wedding, the partnership, the foundation." Andrew left for New York this morning. He said his lawyers told him to cut contact. His father was indicted an hour ago. There was a pause long enough to hear her trying to steady her breathing. "I don't even know what's real anymore," she said. I wanted to tell her it was better this way, that the truth had freed her before she married into a lie, but the words stayed trapped behind my teeth. Some lessons couldn't be softened. That evening, she asked to meet. The restaurant she'd chosen was supposed to host her wedding rehearsal dinner. The place looked frozen in time, silver cutlery laid out on empty tables, the faint smell of roses and champagne still lingering from a celebration that would never happen. A young server hovered near the bar, uncertain whether to approach us or leave us alone. Kendra sat across from me, the engagement ring trembling between her fingers. "He told me he didn't know," she said, voice hollow. "He swore he wasn't part of it." "Maybe he wasn't," I said, "but his family built their empire on it. That's a truth no one can unknow." She nodded, eyes wet but unblinking. "When I met him, I thought he was everything you weren't confident, certain, powerful. I thought he'd never make me feel small." She gave a brittle laugh. "Turns out power just hides smallness better." I stayed quiet, letting her speak. After a long silence, she slipped off the ring and set it on the table. It caught the light flashing briefly before going dull again. "I told him I couldn't wear it anymore," she said. "It felt like debt." She folded her hands together and looked at me. "You didn't come here to say, 'I told you so.' Did you know?" I said. "I came because no one should have to hand back their future alone." Her shoulders trembled. I reached across the table, resting my hand over hers. For the first time since childhood, she didn't pull away. "I'm sorry, Mom," she said quietly, "for everything I said before." The apology landed like a fragile thing, unexpected, almost impossible, and I realized I didn't need to answer. Some griefs speak for themselves. Outside, the sleet had turned to snow, the flakes soft and slow against the windows. Kendra stood, wrapping her coat tighter. At the door, she looked back once. "Will you come home soon?" she asked. "I will," I said. She nodded, then stepped into the cold, the city lights scattering around her. I stayed behind for a moment longer, the empty ring still glinting faintly under the chandelier. Then I picked it up and closed my hand around it, not to keep it, but to remember how something so bright could weigh so little once its meaning was gone. Charleston smelled of salt and spring that night, the kind of air that carried both memory and forgiveness. The city had come alive again after months of headlines and hearings, though the marks of everything that had happened still lingered quietly beneath its elegance. Inside the cultural center, the light was soft and gold, spilling over the polished floors and high-arched windows. The first benefit gala for the Veterans Justice Trust was about to begin. It had taken months of legal wrangling, signatures, and negotiations, but the fund was finally real. It bore my grandfather's name, the Walter Locke Foundation for Truth and Service. People moved through the hall in low, reverent murmurs. Families of pilots, mechanics, engineers whose names had been lost in the archived casualty lists. They wore modest suits, old medals, photographs pinned to their lapels. On the small stage at the front stood a grand piano, and beside it, a single violin resting on its stand. Kendra was there, helping with the seating arrangements, her movements quiet and deliberate. She had changed since that night at the restaurant, less armor, more honesty. When our eyes met, she smiled small but real. Ellen stood near the back, speaking softly with a Navy widow whose husband's name appeared in one of my grandfather's ledgers. She caught my glance and gave a brief nod, the silent language of solidarity. When the lights dimmed, I walked to the stage. The applause was polite, at first uncertain. Then it grew gentle, genuine, like rain starting on water. I lifted the violin and began to play the opening notes of the Silent Key Suite. The music unfolded slowly, shaped by the weight of everything it carried. Each phrase rose and fell like breath, each rest heavy with meaning. Between movements, a voice from the podium read the names of those who had died, their families, standing one by one, as if answering a roll call across time. Some cried openly. Others sat still, eyes closed, letting the sound do what words could not. I played until the hall seemed to breathe with me, the melody filling every empty space that silence had once owned. By the final movement, the violin's tone had softened into something almost human. The theme my grandfather had written 60 years ago returned, transformed now, no longer secret, no longer coded. It was not a requiem anymore. It was release. When the last note faded, the hall stayed quiet for several long seconds. Then applause rose again, not loud, but deep in acknowledgement more than a celebration. I bowed once my hand pressed lightly to the instrument that had carried both my inheritance and my redemption. Kendra met me at the edge of the stage. "They heard him tonight," she said softly. I smiled. So did we. We stood together as the audience began to leave, people pausing to shake hands, to whisper, "Thank you." Near the front row, an elderly man in uniform saluted me with trembling fingers. I returned the gesture, though I'd never worn a uniform myself. Outside, the night air was cool and clean. Across the street, the harbor lights flickered like faint stars, and the wind carried the sound of the last applause as if it were a promise. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was standing in my grandfather's shadow. I was standing beside him, continuing a song that had finally found its ending. The house was still that afternoon, the kind of quiet that felt earned rather than empty. Sunlight slanted through the window, catching the dust motes that drifted lazily above the piano. I'd left the violin on its stand, the bow resting like a bridge between what had been played and what still waited. On the mantel beneath the small brass clock stood a framed photo of my grandfather. Walter Locke in his uniform, young, steady eyes sharp with a kind of patience the world rarely teaches anymore. Next to it lay the folded program from the Foundation concert and a sheet of stationery, the ink still drying. The letter was for Kendra. I had written it slowly, letting the words find their own rhythm. My dearest Kendra, inheritance isn't what we get, it's what we honor. Some people inherit comfort. Others inherit responsibility. I used to think I'd failed you by not leaving enough, but now I understand the most valuable thing we can pass on is the courage to face what others hide. The money, the headlines, the foundation, those will fade. What matters is that we told the truth, and that you know the difference between power and peace. Your grandfather spent his life in silence, not because he was weak, but because he trusted time to bring the right voice. I think that voice was ours. I signed it simply Mom and set it beside Walter's photograph. Outside, the tide was high, the scent of salt and magnolia drifting through the open window. Somewhere down the block, children were laughing, bright, ordinary, alive. I sat on the sofa, letting the quiet settle again. The house felt neither too big nor too small, now just wide enough for memory and music to share the same air. When the clock chimed 3, I rose, straightened the frame on the mantel, and whispered, "We kept the promise." And for the first time in 60 years, I could almost hear him answer. The harbor was pale gold at sunrise, the water smooth enough to hold a reflection without breaking it. The old boathouse had been turned into a classroom now, its wooden beams smelling faintly of salt and varnish, the air alive with the soft tuning of violins. The students, children of veterans, most under 12, sat in a semicircle, their bows poised like question marks, waiting for answers. I moved among them, adjusting fingers, steadying shoulders. Their laughter mixed with the faint cry of gulls outside, bright and unguarded. Kendra stood near the window, helping a boy retune his violin. She'd taken to the work, easily patient, in a way I'd rarely seen before. When the boy struck the right note, she smiled a small, unpracticed smile that made her look younger than she had in years. "You were right," she said quietly as I passed by. Music does tell the truth. It always did, I said. We just needed to listen. When everyone was ready, I lifted my bow and they followed. The first notes rose together, imperfect but sincere, drifting through the open doors and out toward the bay. The sunlight scattered across the water, like it was keeping time for us. In that moment, it didn't matter who I had been: a teacher, a mother, an heir to silence. The past had become rhythm, steady and forgiving. Each child's note joined the next, the melody widening until it filled the air between sea and sky. Kendra glanced over her eyes, bright in the light. I nodded once, and she began to play too. The sound was simple, clear, and impossibly alive. Beyond the window, the tide moved in gentle measure, and the harbor sang it back.